On July 1st, 2021, a new Chinese proficiency standard takes effect. This will have big consequences for the HSK, the most widely used proficiency test for non-native speakers. What are these changes and what do they mean for you as a student? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about the new HSK 3.0. So for those of you who are new to learning Chinese, the HSK or 汉语水平考试, the most widely used proficiency test for Mandarin Chinese for non-native speakers. So this is the test you take if you need a certificate for some reason, unless you are studying in Taiwan, in which case you will take the TOCFL instead. But here we are focusing on the HSK. So, like I said in the introduction, there is a new standard that takes effect later this week, and this will eventually have fairly big consequences for the HSK, although as we shall see, it will take some time before this actually influences most students. In this episode, I want to go through what we know about this new exam, some changes that will probably come, and a little bit how to think about this as a student. The first thing I want to say is that there are many things that are not known about the new version of the HSK at this point. So like I said, what takes effect on July 1st is a new standard. And a standard is not the same as an exam, although it is true that this is the standard that the exams are based on, which means that the exams will change in the future. And this is probably the source of many of the misconceptions and misunderstandings about the changes that will come that you see online everywhere, because people talk about this a lot. That is that no, the HSK, the exams themselves, will not change on July 1st. In fact, as we shall see, it will probably take a few years before anything significant happens for most students. So it's important also to know then that the standard is not the same as the exam in the sense that something might be described in a standard, but that does not necessarily mean that this will be tested on a certain exam. Still, looking at this standard can probably tell us a lot about where the HSK is going, which is what we are going to talk about today. The biggest change is probably the scope of the test. So we're used to a test with 6 levels, and the new HSK will have 9 instead. And this is not just that they have added 3 levels, the 6 current levels will also be reshaped quite a lot. So you can think of it as a new test that has 9 levels instead of 6, and that in general it covers a bigger part of the language and it also covers higher proficiency levels. And like I said, there are many things we don't know here, but we know that Hanban, which is the government-affiliated institution that manages the HSK, have said that the new levels, that's 7 to 9, will roll out first with some kind of pilot test later this year, probably in December, and then with proper actual exams in March 2022. Now, when it comes to HSK 1 to 6, they will remain the same for the foreseeable future, i.e. they will not change. But gradually, these levels will also change to conform to the new standard, and this is projected to take between 3 and 5 years. This is a fairly vague timetable, and when we're talking about the future, it is of course hard to know exactly what will happen, so don't be surprised if these numbers turn out to be incorrect. But in general, at least, we're talking about new advanced exams in the near future and new exams for all the other students in the coming 3 to 5 years. So let's look at what this means for you as a student. And I want to be very honest here. For most students, this means absolutely nothing. It has zero impact on your learning. There is a tendency to care a lot about proficiency exams, and especially the HSK when it comes to Chinese, and I've never, to be honest, really understood this. So for example, when people realized that there would be new levels to HSK and that the current ones wouldn't match exactly with the new ones and so on, many people were dismayed and even maybe angry or frustrated, and for me this is very strange. For a large majority of people, what happens with a proficiency exam like this has no impact on your learning whatsoever. So for most of you, you can actually stop listening to this episode. You can just go and learn some Chinese instead. Listen to something nice, maybe read something you've been putting off. You don't actually need the HSK. Okay, if you're still here, I presume that you are interested in the HSK, so I am going to talk about it a little bit. So the reason why the HSK is not as important as people think is that you really only need it for 2 purposes, I would say. One of them is if you actually want the certificate, if you need it for a very specific purpose. For example, you want to apply to a university and they require you to have a certificate, then of course this will matter. I will get back to this later. It also matters maybe if you use it for benchmarking purposes, but then again, changing the standard doesn't change anything. Indeed, this seems very strange to me that people are upset. For example, just to show you one thing, if you are in the current HSK 3, which contains around 600 words, in terms of vocabulary, that will be equal to the new HSK 1, which has around 500, which is sort of the same. And if you feel that your Chinese has kind of been downgraded by this, I think that you're looking at this in the wrong way. To me, this seems a little bit like a golfer from the United States who is proud of his long drive. And then when traveling to Europe and we suddenly start measuring in meters instead of yards, of course, the number that measures how far you are able to hit the ball, it goes down because a meter is longer than a yard. And so the number goes down. This is what happens here. Just because you change the yardstick, as it were, it doesn't influence your ability to communicate in Chinese. It doesn't influence anything at all, actually, unless you're interested in the certificate itself. But it doesn't change your language ability at all. It doesn't matter if it says you have HSK 1 or 55. Your ability is exactly the same. This is true in general, I think. The way we measure something doesn't change the thing measured, usually, and the map is not the territory, and so on and so forth. And a proficiency test is not the language, so the HSK is certainly not the same thing as the Chinese language. In one sense, though, you can use the HSK as a kind of roadmap for learning Chinese, and this makes more sense. Because everybody, when they learn something, especially something huge like a language, needs to have some kind of feeling of where you're going and some kind of measurement of how it's going. And then using a test like the HSK is what most people default to, even though that is problematic in many ways. And just to bring up one thing is that the HSK doesn't test you on everything. It only tests you on a few selected things, and there is so much more to learning Chinese and communicating with people that is not captured in a test like this. So putting too much emphasis on an exam like this, even if you'd only do it as a kind of roadmap, is not good. Anyway, I expect that most people will just ignore what I just said, and everybody's going to care an awful lot about what happens to the HSK, even though they don't actually need to. So let's look at some of the things that are interesting in this new standard. And remember that I said that we don't know exactly how this will be implemented on the exam. But we do know, for example, that the official document lists characters that are supposed to be written by hand and that the student is supposed to know maybe the composition, some basic etymology, and so on. And these are actually listed in the document, which characters they refer to, and roughly in vague terms what people are supposed to know on different levels. Will this be tested on the exam? Maybe. Will it be on the exam by default? Who knows? So when it comes to handwriting, there are 300 characters for HSK 1 to 3, then another 400 for the next 3 levels, and then 500 for the final 3. For the lower levels, it mentions copying characters, so we can assume that this means that you don't necessarily have to recall these characters from memory, but you are supposed to be able to copy them at a decent pace, meaning that you're somewhat familiar with characters, maybe you know stroke order, but you don't have to actually be able to recall every single stroke on your own. Now, on the higher levels, that it doesn't mention copying anymore, and it starts mentioning knowledge about characters. And on the highest 3 levels, it just simply adds more characters. As many of you probably know already, I also work for Scritter and Jacob Gill, and I have spent an awful lot of time recently working with these word lists because we want to have them available in Scritter. And this is, of course, particularly true for the handwriting list because Scritter is, of course, the best app when it comes to learning handwriting specifically. So we want to have these lists available. And we finished that project just now, and this is why I have this podcast episode today. So if you want to check that out, go to Scritter directly, or you can go to the written version of this podcast episode, where I have links to all these decks in Scritter. In general, though, these handwriting lists basically contains very high frequency characters that I think make sense to learn to write if you care about handwriting. I'm much more hesitant to say that everybody should do this. Well, I think it would be good for their learning to learn to handwrite at least a few hundred characters, but maybe not 1200. Another thing that appears in the standard document and that is very interesting is that translation is mentioned from HSK 4 and up. And this is something that, if it's implemented on the exam, would mean a very big shift. And there are some questions surrounding that. For example, which languages will you be allowed to translate to or from, except Chinese? For example, my native language is Swedish. Will I be able to use that? I highly doubt that, and of course for me personally it doesn't matter, I obviously know English as well, but I can imagine people speaking languages that are not that widely spoken across the world that will have real trouble here if they don't also know one of these other bigger languages that will be on the exam. And we still don't know, is this going to be part of all the exams, or is it just maybe going to be part of a specific exam? Hard to say. And it seems a little bit weird because to me, translation is just one thing that you can use a language for. You can be very good at a language without being good at translating it. It also seems slightly weird here because this is an element that many native speakers, I would say most native speakers, would fail on the higher levels. So if you look at the requirements that are specified for translation on HSK 9, they are essentially professional translator level. And that's something that I would certainly fail and most native speakers would fail as well. It is not really something you do unless you spend time translating in various contexts, learning to translate in professional situations. Indeed, the word professional is used to describe this level, and it seems a little bit weird to me that this would be a requirement on a Chinese proficiency test. Still, I want to remind everybody again that this probably doesn't influence you at all. And I'll just give an example here. I've studied Chinese for 14 years now, and I have still not taken an official HSK exam. Why? Because I have zero reason to do so. Now, naturally, I've taken lots of mock exams because I want to understand the HSK, I want to know how it works, and so on. And I have taken the Taiwanese counterpart, the TOCFL, many times, mostly because it was convenient and I used it as a kind of benchmarking of my ability. And I also had to take it twice for scholarship purposes once, and then I was also required to pass it in the master's degree program I studied. Okay, let's say that you actually do care about the certificate. You're not just after the benchmarking or roadmap or something like that. You really want the certificate for some reason. So here I've identified 3 different situations. So the first one is that you're a beginner or intermediate learner. That would be current HSK 1 to 5 or something like that. If you are in this category, these new changes will probably not affect you at all. The reason is that it will take years before any of these exams become available that are on your level, and by the time they become available, your situation will have changed a lot. Maybe you work as an interpreter and you don't really care about the HSK anymore. Now, the second scenario is that if you're an advanced learner, and that would be current HSK 6 or above, who needs a certificate? This is probably the most interesting category because there might actually be actions that you should take now rather than later. And this is all pure speculation on my part, but it could be the case that institutions or companies start requiring the highest available level of HSK. That's something that they could do maybe out of ignorance. For example, if they currently require the HSK 6, will they then later require HSK 9 just because that's the highest level and they don't really know what that means, even though HSK 9 is much, much more advanced than the current HSK 6, and maybe much more advanced than they actually need for the post or the position you are applying for. In this case, it could make sense to get the HSK 6 certificate now, because then you can at least claim that it was the highest available when you took it. I'm not sure how well that will convince people of your Chinese ability, but it has worked for me at least once. The third scenario is that you're an advanced learner who's looking for a challenge. And this is the best position to be in because the new HSK, the 3.0, will cover a lot more than the old one, so you will have more of a roadmap, as it were. For example, if we compare with the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, which contains 6 levels, A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, and C2, where A1 is the lowest and C1 is the highest. The current HSK 6, according to most teacher associations in Europe, rank as B2. So that means that the levels C1 and C2 are not covered by the current HSK. Now, it remains to be seen how well the C1 and C2 levels are covered by the new HSK, but it's very likely to be much closer to matching other standards like this. And the HSK 9 indeed seems to be very advanced indeed. Like I promised earlier, I will now round this off by saying a few words about the character and word lists that Jake and I have created over at Skritter. First and foremost, we have created decks for HSK 1 through 9. That's a total of around 11,000 words. And there are several word lists floating around on the internet, but we didn't really trust the OCRing and so on, so we checked all of these manually and, I don't know, found maybe a few dozen mistakes or so. And we fixed those, and we imported all of these into Skritter. The original lists are sorted alphabetically, which is horrible for language learning, so we sorted these by frequency instead, and that is very important, especially for the bigger lists, because it means that you will now learn the most important words and characters in these lists first. And for the 7 to 9 list, which is more than 5,000 words long, it's kind of important that you put the important ones at the beginning and the rarer ones at the end. If you want links to these, you can check the written article on Hacking Chinese or over at Skritter. Next, we did the same thing for handwriting, which I kind of already talked about, so I will not say that much about it. These lists are also sorted by frequency, so you are guaranteed to learn the more important characters first. We also have some ideas for how to spice this up in future. For example, there is a time attack mode in Skritter where people can compete against themselves and against others to try to write a certain number of characters as quickly as possible, by hand I mean, on screen. And we will probably try to do this with these handwriting lists from the new HSK, so be on the lookout for that. Something else I want to do is to update the old article I have where I look at what words are missing or are seriously delayed in the HSK, and do that for the new HSK. Because there are some words that appear very late in these lists, but they are actually very common, so it's a bit odd that they appear late. In general, there are also many things on these word lists that are actually not words, but phrases, and some of them appear at what seems to be random locations in these lists. So for example, in HSK 1, we have 是不是, okay, very common. And then in HSK 3, we have 能不能, which would seem to be the same level as 是不是, and typically taught about the same time. Then in HSK 6, which is rather advanced, we have 有没有. And I have no idea what this is about, and maybe it's related to some grammar point, because the standard also mentions grammar, but I don't see anything that will motivate 有没有 to be in HSK 6. So let's wrap this episode up by saying that if you want to learn more about these, you should check out the article, because it also contains a lot of links to some official accounts you can follow if you want to learn more. And there are also some neat graphical comparisons between the new HSK, the old HSK, current, and so on. And some of these are rather neat, some of them are even interactive, and I link to some of them in the blog post. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.